I noticed you when I arrived hours ago. I've been watching you.
Thank you.
It's basic decency.
She showed kindness to a stranger. Then he made her a Viscountess. Alexander Sutherland, Viscount of Ashmont, had been standing near the refreshment tables for nearly 2 hours, and his stomach was beginning to protest. Nobody had offered him anything, not once. He shifted his weight slowly, pressing one weathered hand against his ribs where hunger gnawed like an insistent creature, and watched the latest group of ladies drift past without so much as a sideways glance. Their silk gowns whispered against the garden paths. Their laughter rang across the manicured lawns, light and careless, untouched by awareness. To them, he was invisible, just another vagabond lingering at the periphery of Ashmont Manor, exactly as he'd planned. Alexander had chosen his disguise with deliberate care. The brown traveling coat was worn at the cuffs and collar, the sort of thing a man wore when he'd seen too many roads and too few homes. His trousers were dusty at the hem. He deliberately walked through the village before arriving, kicking up the unpaved lanes. He'd let his dark hair fall across his forehead in an unkempt way, had foregone shaving for 3 days until his jaw was shadowed with stubble, had even dirtied his hands and left a smudge of earth across one cheekbone. The disguise was perfect, nearly flawless, but this elaborate deception was necessary. Alexander needed to see them as they truly were, not the practiced smiles and rehearsed conversation they performed when they knew he was the master of this estate. He needed to understand what lived beneath the performance, beneath the careful curation of themselves they offered to men of rank and fortune. His cousin Edward had warned him this was madness 3 weeks ago, sitting in his study with the evening light fading beyond the windows. "You're looking for a saint, Alex," Edward had said, swirling brandy in his glass with the languid confidence of a man who'd never questioned the world's basic corruption. "You'll find only disappointment. People are people. Women are worse. They're trained from birth to calculate their worth based on a man's title and fortune." But Edward was wrong. Alexander had to believe Edward was wrong, because if his cousin was right, then the world was exactly as hollow and transactional as it appeared, and Alexander would be forced to marry for duty alone, to choose some eligible woman based on bloodline and property, to spend the rest of his life beside someone who'd been taught to want him only for what he represented. He'd orchestrated this garden party with meticulous care, working through channels that kept his fingerprints invisible. He'd suggested it to Lord Ashworth through careful conversation about local tradition, had ensured that his invitation list circulated through the county without his name attached to the suggestion. Every eligible woman within 50 miles had received an invitation, and he had dressed as someone nobody of consequence would notice, someone whose hunger would reveal character more clearly than any drawing room conversation ever could. Alexander stood at the edge of the refreshment tables, watching the theater of it all unfold before him. Alexander had spent his entire life being visible to everyone, yet nobody truly saw him. And on this afternoon, standing hungry and invisible at the edge of his own garden party, he was about to discover whether anyone in this world was capable of seeing past the costume of class to recognize the human being underneath. What he didn't know was that one woman would transform everything he believed possible. Lady Pemberton walked past first, her nose elevated as if detecting an unpleasant odor. She didn't pause, didn't acknowledge. The way her eyes slid over him, through him, was the practiced art of a woman accustomed to erasing what didn't suit her vision. Miss Ashford came next with her companions, gesturing animatedly about something she'd heard in town. When she noticed him, or seemed to notice him, it was only to shift her path slightly wider, the way one might adjust course to avoid a puddle. The Duchess of Helmsworth was more direct. She actually pointed at him and called out to one of the footmen, "That man is blocking the view toward the gardens. Have him move." She didn't address him. She directed his removal as one might direct the repositioning of furniture. Hours stretched, The afternoon sun climbed higher, relentless and warm. Alexander's shirt, already worn thin in his disguise, began to stick to his back with perspiration. His ribs ached with hunger. He'd deliberately eaten little that morning, wanting the physical reality of need to inform his posture, his expression, his entire being. He was beginning to understand the depth of his despair, the way it sank into bone and blood when a basic human need went unacknowledged hour after hour. The hunger was no longer just physical, it was spiritual. It was the hunger of a man so accustomed to being seen that invisibility had become unbearable. He was beginning to think Edward had been right. Perhaps this was madness. Perhaps people were simply people, and expecting more from them was the true sickness, the romantic delusion of a man who had spent too long insulated by privilege. Perhaps he should end this, return to his chambers, resume his proper identity, accept that the world was exactly as he'd always suspected it to be. Perhaps, "Excuse me, sir, you look terribly hungry." If you know someone who's ever felt invisible despite being surrounded by people, if you know someone who's been overlooked, dismissed, rendered unimportant by circumstance, share this story with them right now, because what happens next will remind them why kindness still matters. He looked up from the edge of the lawn where he'd drifted. She stood perhaps 6 feet away, slightly out of breath, as if she'd hurried to reach him before she lost her nerve. She was not what he expected. Her dress was modest, blue cotton, well-made but clearly worn, the kind of thing a woman wore for practicality rather than display. A small hat was pinned sensibly to her dark hair, which was gathered without elaborate curls or fashionable arrangements. She wore no jewelry except a single cameo at her throat. She was not beautiful in the classical way society preferred. Her nose was too prominent, her mouth too wide, her features too honest. But her eyes were extraordinary, warm brown and startlingly clear, like looking into water on a bright day. And they were looking at him, actually looking, not through him, not past him, at him. "I noticed you when I arrived," she said quietly, taking a step closer. "Hours ago. I've been watching you become hungrier and more tired with each passing hour, and I thought—" She held out a cloth-wrapped bundle, and he could smell the bread before he could fully process what was happening. Fresh bread, still warm, wrapped with care. "The kitchens are busy with preparations for dinner. No one's paying attention. I brought you this." Alexander stared at the bundle in her extended hands. There were no gloves. Her hands were bare, showing calluses from work, the practical hands of someone accustomed to labor. There was an ink stain on her index finger, as if she spent time writing or keeping records. She'd seen him working, laboring invisibly, and instead of ignoring him or commanding him away, she'd gone to the kitchens. She had taken bread from whatever was meant for the household's own meal. She had wrapped it with deliberate care and carried it to him. "Thank you," he said, and was surprised to hear his voice come out rough, strangled by emotion he hadn't anticipated feeling. He took the bread carefully, and for a moment their fingers brushed. He felt the warmth of her hand, the genuine solidity of human contact. "That's very kind." "It's basic decency," she replied, and there was something in her tone, not pity, not condescension, but a kind of dry acknowledgement of a world that seemed to have forgotten its most fundamental values, which seems to be in rather short supply today. She was right. Alexander had watched it all afternoon. The casual cruelty, the easy dismissal, the way his hunger had become invisible to every woman here. But this woman, this stranger, had seen it, had responded to it, had acted on something as fundamental as compassion. "I'm Violet," she said, and the name seemed to suit her. Simple, genuine, rooted like a flower growing in honest earth. Violet Cottage, I'm a paid companion here, to Mrs. Harrington. I should return before she notices I've wandered off. He should have given her a false name. He'd prepared one, something common and unremarkable. But looking at her, at those clear, honest eyes, at the woman who had seen him when no one else could be bothered to look, the lie stuck in his throat. Alexander, he said instead, using his true first name, though he left his title unspoken. I'm Alexander. Well, Alexander, Violet said, and she smiled then, and it transformed her entire face into something luminous. You should eat that before it gets cold, and perhaps... She hesitated, glancing back toward the main party where other ladies were beginning to gather. Perhaps there's hope for the world yet, if people like you exist in it. She turned to leave, and Alexander wanted to call her back, wanted to keep her there, wanted to understand how someone could be so genuinely kind in a world so thoroughly corrupted by self-interest. But she was already walking away, and he was left holding warm bread in his hands, understanding for the first time that perhaps Edward had been wrong. Perhaps there was one woman capable of seeing past the costume to the human being underneath, and he had just met her. As Alexander spent more time with Violet, something unexpected happened. The test was becoming obsolete. She wasn't a woman being measured against his expectations anymore. She was a woman he was falling in love with. And the lie he'd constructed, the disguise, the false identity, the elaborate deception, was beginning to feel less like a necessary test and more like a prison of his own making. What would happen when she discovered the truth? Would the kindness in her eyes transform into something else entirely? The sun had begun its descent when Alexander found himself drifting back toward the garden bench where Mrs. Harrington sat beneath a spreading oak, Violet positioned attentively at her side. He told himself it was accident, mere circumstance that kept drawing him past that particular corner of the grounds. But it was a lie, and he was increasingly aware of the taste of it. Violet glanced up as he passed, and something in her expression shifted. A brightening, a recognition. She excused herself to fetch water for her elderly charge, and in that brief errand, their paths aligned. Alexander found himself walking beside her toward the garden fountain. "You're still here," she said, and he heard relief in her voice, as if she'd been uncertain whether he would stay. "I find myself reluctant to leave," he replied, which was dangerously close to the truth. Over the following hours, they spoke in fragments stolen between her duties, brief conversations conducted in borrowed moments. She told him about the books she read aloud to Mrs. Harrington, poetry mostly, philosophy, stories that illuminated small moments of beauty in ordinary life. "People assume my work is dull," she said, arranging Mrs. Harrington's shawl with careful attention, "but there's profound beauty in witnessing someone's mind engage with ideas, in watching them discover something that moves them. Mrs. Harrington is kind, which makes it bearable. Most people assume a companion must be desperate or unfortunate, but some of us choose service because it feels like the right thing to do." Alexander heard himself saying things he hadn't intended to say. How weary he'd become of surfaces, of conversations that meant nothing, of women who performed versions of themselves rather than inhabiting their own authenticity. How desperate he was to find something, someone, real in a world so thoroughly committed to artifice. "I've been searching," he found himself admitting, "for proof that kindness still exists, that there are people who see beyond what's convenient or profitable." Violet turned to him, and her eyes held something that made his chest tighten. "You look like someone who's been searching for a very long time." The chemistry between them was undeniable, electric and terrifying in its immediacy. When she spoke about the small joys she'd learned to find in service, her entire face transformed. When she described noticing the way morning light moved across Mrs. Harrington's garden, Her voice carried a tenderness that spoke of a soul fundamentally oriented toward beauty. Alexander found himself utterly captivated by her, not despite her modesty and obscurity, but because of it. She was real in a way no woman he'd ever encountered could claim to be. But with each moment of genuine connection, the lie beneath his feet grew more unbearable. She believed him to be a traveling man of modest means, someone displaced by circumstance. She didn't know he was the master of this estate, that he'd orchestrated this entire encounter, that her kindness had been the object of a test. The deception pressed against his chest like something alive, something that would eventually demand to be acknowledged. Alexander was trapped between two worlds. In one world, he was the Viscount of Ashmont, a man of rank and privilege, bound by duty and expectation. In the other world, he was simply Alexander, a man who'd been seen and chosen by a woman who knew nothing of his title, his wealth, or his power. And he was running out of time to choose which world he wanted to inhabit, because the truth was about to find him whether he was ready or not. Leaving Ashmont Manor without her direction was not an option Alexander could consider. The thought of returning to London, to his estates, to the machinery of his life without knowing where she was or how to find her again, was unbearable. So he stayed, ostensibly at the village inn, and began the work of locating her with the kind of careful discretion his rank demanded. The answers came easily. A discreet inquiry to the local vicar led him to Cottage's End, a modest house where Mrs. Harrington lived in quiet retirement with her companion, Violet Cottage. The name seemed to contain a kind of poetry. Over the following weeks, their encounters multiplied with careful orchestration disguised as serendipity. He positioned himself on the road she walked each morning. He appeared at the village church on Sundays, standing in the shadows at the rear as Violet sat beside her elderly charge. Each meeting deepened what lay between them, but the machinery of his other life was beginning to grind insistently at the edges of this constructed world. His valet's letters had grown increasingly pointed. His solicitors sent correspondence marked urgent, detailing business that required his attention. His mother had moved from bewilderment to outright fury, her latest missive arriving with language so sharp it seemed to cut through the paper itself. He'd been absent from London for 6 weeks. The season was advancing. There were matters of inheritance that could not be indefinitely delayed. Alexander ignored it all, but Violet was beginning to notice what he could no longer conceal. Small inconsistencies accumulated like dust. She'd once commented on his hands, not rough enough for a genuine laborer, despite weeks of work. He'd mentioned casually a knowledge of French that a traveling man shouldn't possess. More damning, there was the way he sometimes forgot himself entirely, the aristocratic bearing that would slip through when he was absorbed in conversation, the unconscious authority in his voice when he directed her toward a chair or suggested she rest. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden with Mrs. Harrington dozing nearby, Violet turned to him directly. Her brown eyes held no accusation, only genuine confusion. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "Not your name, not your occupation, but who are you, truly? There's something you're not telling me." The question hung between them like a blade. He opened his mouth, closed it. The truth sat on his tongue, bitter and heavy. "I'm not what I seem," he finally said, each word careful. "But I can't explain yet, not without risking everything." She didn't push further, but something had shifted. She'd seen the fracture in his facade, and her trust, though not yet broken, had begun to splinter. Alexander realized with devastating clarity that the disguise had never been meant to test her at all. It had been meant to test him, and he was failing catastrophically. He'd come to discover if kindness existed in the world. Instead, he'd found it. He'd found her. And in finding her, he'd lost the ability to tell her the truth without destroying her. If you believe in second chances, If you believe that love can transform even the most calculated deceptions, if you've ever been tested by life and found yourself tested in return, subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here is about the power of choosing authenticity in a world built on performance. New stories drop every week, and each one will remind you why truth is worth the cost. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of transformation. The garden at Mrs. Harrington's house had become sacred ground, the place where they'd spent countless afternoons speaking in fragments of real conversation, where he'd read poetry aloud while Violet listened with her entire being, where he'd felt, for the first time in his life, that someone knew him. It was there he chose to tell her. He came in the late afternoon, when she would be there alone, but he didn't come as Alexander the Traveler. He came as himself. The fine clothes preceded him. Tailored coat of dark wool, perfectly pressed linen, boots polished to a mirror shine. His hair was arranged with careful precision. His jaw was clean-shaven, revealing the aristocratic line his 3-week disguise had hidden. Authority clung to him like an additional garment, unavoidable and absolute. Violet was examining the roses when she heard his footsteps. She turned, and he watched understanding bloom across her face in the space of a heartbeat. Understanding, recognition, the shock of betrayal visible in the sudden paleness of her complexion. "You," she whispered, then louder, in her voice trembling with an emotion too complex to name. "You lied to me. All of it. Everything was a test?" There was no point in pretense. The moment demanded absolute honesty, even if that honesty came too late. "I came to the garden party testing the women of society," he said quietly. "All of them. I was searching for one woman capable of genuine kindness to someone she believed beneath her. I was searching for proof that authenticity still existed in a world of performance." He paused, watching her struggle with the enormity of it. "You were that person. You are that person." Violet turned away from him, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding herself together. "So I passed your test. How fortunate for me. How convenient that my kindness satisfied your requirements." Her voice trembled with a fury born from hurt. The particular pain of realizing kindness had been weaponized against her. "Did you plan all of it? Every encounter, every conversation? Was anything real?" The shame was white-hot, consuming, but beneath it lay something more urgent, the need for her to understand. "Everything was real," he said, and his voice carried a rawness that demanded attention. "I didn't plan for you to matter. I came here testing whether kindness existed. You passed that test in ways that transformed my entire understanding of what's possible in this world. But then I became the one being tested. I became the one being measured by the standard you'd set." He stepped closer, needing her to hear this. "Every day with you made the lie more unbearable. You saw kindness as ordinary duty. You gave without expecting return. You were real when everyone else was performance. And I couldn't bear to tell you the truth because I was terrified of seeing the woman who showed me kindness transform into someone who saw only my deception." Violet turned to face him, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment he saw her doubt herself, the small, terrible moment where she wondered if her kindness had been foolish, if her generosity had marked her as naive, as easy to manipulate. But then she saw him, really saw him. The man beneath the fine clothes was the same man she'd seen in the garden, terrified, stripped bare, vulnerable in a way no title could armor against. "This is madness," she said, and her voice carried the weight of all the reasons she was right. "Alexander, I'm nobody. I'm a paid companion. I have no fortune, no family of consequence, no standing in society whatsoever. Your mother will be horrified. Your world will devour me and spit me out. Society will tear us apart. Each word was a mirror held up to the brutal reality of their circumstances. She spoke with the clarity of someone who understood her own worthlessness in the hierarchy that governed their world. Alexander felt something crystallize inside him. For the first time since his adolescence, he understood what it meant to choose freely. Not duty, not expectation, not the weight of centuries of accumulated obligation, simply choice. I can have any woman with the right name and the right fortune, he said quietly. The world will bring them to me. Ambitious mothers, calculating daughters, women trained from birth to want what I represent. I could accept one of them. I could do my duty and secure my line and live a perfectly acceptable, perfectly hollow life. He stepped toward her, closing the distance she'd created. But I don't want any woman. I want you. The woman who brought bread to a stranger when she owed him nothing. The woman who saw me when I was invisible. The woman who taught me that kindness isn't a performance. It's the only authentic thing that exists in this world. Violet shook her head, but he saw the beginning of something shift in her expression, a hairline fracture in her certainty of their impossibility. I'm afraid, he continued, and there was no armor left in his voice. I'm terrified. I've spent my entire life being visible to everyone and truly seen by no one. You saw me, and now I'm offering you everything I am, knowing full well that it might not be enough, knowing that society will make you suffer for choosing me, knowing that I have no guarantee you'll forgive what I've done. He held out his hand. I'm asking you to be brave enough to take a risk on someone who tested you without your knowledge. I'm asking you to believe that the man you came to care for is worth the cost of the world's judgment. Violet looked at his hand as if it were a doorway to a world she'd never believed could exist for her. She thought of that moment at the garden party, the moment she'd chosen to act on compassion, to see a hungry man and respond with her own sustenance. She'd chosen kindness then because it was right, because it was necessary, because some instinct deeper than logic had told her it was the only choice. Could she choose love now for the same reason? The world would say it was foolish. The world would say she was foolish. But the world had never asked her name. The world had never seen her. The world had taught her that her kindness was worthless, her station irrelevant, her value immeasurable. She took his hand. The garden at sunset held them both, surrounded by the roses they'd tended together, the flowers that had witnessed every stolen conversation, every moment of growing understanding. The light was golden, softened by distance, turning the ordinary world into something ethereal. Alexander raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, but it was not the formal gesture of a viscount performing duty. It was a question and an answer and a plea all at once. Then he kissed her properly, and it was nothing like the practiced elegance he'd been trained in since childhood. It was gentle and asking and utterly worshipful, a kiss that said without words, I see you. I choose you. I choose this, knowing everything it will cost. When he drew back, Violet's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if she needed time to return from wherever that kiss had taken her. When she opened them, there was something new in her expression. Not the hesitant kindness of the woman who'd brought him bread, not the confused hurt of the woman who'd learned of his deception, but something crystalline, certainty. We should discuss what comes next, she said quietly, and her voice was steady in a way that suggested she'd already made her peace with the cost. The scandal will be fierce, Alexander said, because she deserved his honesty. Society will not be kind. My mother will write letters that read like declarations of war. Her friends will visit her to offer condolences, as if I've died. We'll be whispered about at every gathering, dissected by people who've never spoken to you, judged by a world that measures women by the name they're born with. Violet nodded, absorbing this without flinching. I'll have to leave Mrs. Harrington's employ. She'll be kind about it, but the village will see it as confirmation of what they suspected. A paid companion doesn't refuse to become a viscountess for no reason. There will be theories, rumors. There will be, Alexander acknowledged, and none of it will matter, because I will not spend my life living according to society's expectations ever again. I tested the world to see if kindness existed. It does. It exists in you. And I'm not willing to sacrifice that on the altar of propriety. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. I spent my entire life being visible to everyone and truly seen by no one. You made me matter by treating me like I was human, not like I was a title or an estate or a name in a genealogy. You saw a hungry man and you brought him bread. You saw a weary soul and you listened. That's the gift I'm keeping, Violet. Not society's blessing, not my mother's approval. You. She leaned into his touch, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute commitment. Then I choose you. I choose this. I choose the scandal and the gossip and the impossibility of it all. Because I'd rather spend my life with a man who chose to be honest than waste it playing safe with someone who would keep me invisible. They stood in the fading light, surrounded by flowers, bound by nothing but choice and genuine love. The letters from London arrived with the regularity of a dark tide. Each one bore his mother's seal and carried language increasingly scorching in its condemnation. A viscount did not marry women of no consequence. A viscount did not sacrifice station and respectability on the altar of romantic fancy. A viscount did not validate the delusion of a woman who'd been trained to serve by elevating her above her station. The words were meant to wound, and they did, but not in the way his mother intended. The town of Cottage's End gossiped with the fervor of people who'd never before been at the center of genuine scandal. A paid companion marrying the Viscount of Ashmont was not the sort of thing that happened in the ordinary progression of society. It was aberration, impossibility made flesh. The ladies who'd dismissed Alexander in the gardens whispered with a mixture of fascination and fury. Lady Pemberton issued a carefully worded statement suggesting she'd never truly seen him at all. The Duchess of Helmsworth simply stopped leaving her home, as if refusing to acknowledge the scandal could make it cease to exist. But there were consequences beyond whispers. An invitation to Lord Thornbury's autumn ball was rescinded, politely but unmistakably. Several influential ladies of the county ceased visiting Ashmont Manor. A gentleman's club in London removed his name from their rolls without explanation, though the explanation was implicit in their silence. Mrs. Harrington, however, surprised them all. When Violet came to her with the news of her engagement, the elderly woman had simply smiled and squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "You've been the daughter I never had," Mrs. Harrington said quietly. "I won't pretend society will forgive this. But I also won't pretend to care what society thinks. You deserve someone who sees you, Violet, and he clearly does." Yet even Mrs. Harrington's kindness couldn't shield them from the weight of public judgment. Alexander and Violet responded by building their own world, one that existed in defiance of society's approval. They spent evenings in the library reading aloud to each other, conversations flowing from poetry to philosophy to their own private dreams. They built gardens together, transforming the grounds of Ashmont Manor into something that reflected both of them, practical and beautiful, grounded and aspirational. When invitations stopped arriving, they stopped expecting them. When neighbors ceased calling, they stopped preparing for callers. They found, to their surprise, that the world's judgment mattered far less than they'd feared, not because it didn't sting, but because what they'd built together was more valuable than anything society could offer. The autumn light filtered through the library windows at Ashmont Manor as Alexander stood watching his wife. She was reading aloud, poetry, as always, her voice carrying the words with the tenderness of someone who'd learned that beauty could exist, even in damaged places. Violet had transformed Ashmont in ways he never could have anticipated. The house that had felt like a fortress of solitude had become genuinely warm. Servants moved through the halls with purpose rather than fear. The gardens bloomed with intention rather than merely existing, and she moved through it all as if she'd always belonged there, because he realized she had. She'd belonged the moment she chose to see him. The letters from his mother had gradually softened, not to warmth, but to resigned acceptance. She'd visited once, several months into their marriage, and had observed Violet with sharp eyes. When she left, she'd pressed her hand briefly and said simply, "You make him happy, and that's enough." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't approval, but it was something. Some of his social circles had never recovered from the scandal, but others, surprising others, had quietly moved past it. Younger women of rank had begun visiting, and he'd noticed them watching Violet with something other than judgment. Interest, perhaps. Recognition that his wife's character was worth more than her birth. The morning light caught on the diamond ring he'd commissioned for her. Nothing ostentatious, but fine and true, visible and beautiful. She twisted it absently as she read, a gesture so habitual it spoke of comfort and belonging. "Do you regret it?" he asked, and the question contained layers of meaning. Not just the marriage, but all of it. The deception, the revelation, the choice to love him despite the cost. She looked up from her book, and her eyes held that same warmth that had first undone him. "Never," she said simply, "though I maintain you were extraordinary foolish to test the world with hunger as your measure. What if nobody had noticed? What if you'd never left that garden party?" "Then I would have found you another way," he said, "because the universe had already decided what it wanted. I was only stubborn enough to insist it be honest about it." She smiled, that transformative smile that made her entire face luminous. "Well then, I suppose we were both stubborn enough to find each other." He moved to her, and she set down her book to make room for him. They sat together as the light continued its slow journey across the room, perfectly content in their shared silence. From a distance, looking in, their story would have seemed like a fairy tale, the Viscount and the companion, love conquering class and deception. But living it was something different. It was daily choice. It was continual commitment to seeing each other truly. It was the decision, made every morning, to keep building the world they'd created together rather than accepting the one society had designed for them. Alexander had come searching for proof that kindness existed. What he'd found instead was proof that love did. Deep, transformative, honest love that demanded everything and offered everything in return. And it was worth every cost. As Violet reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture so simple it contained the entire story of their becoming, Alexander understood with perfect clarity that he'd found what he'd been searching for all along. Not just a woman who was kind to strangers, but a woman who was willing to be kind to him, even when he didn't deserve it, even when he'd tested her, even when the world demanded she choose differently. That was the real miracle. Not that kindness existed, but that she'd chosen to extend it to him, knowing full well what he'd done, choosing him anyway. In the library of Ashmont Manor, surrounded by books and light and the woman he loved, Alexander finally felt truly seen. And that was everything. Like this video, share and hit the subscribe button now. Don't forget to toggle on your notification button. Thanks for watching.